Hello, and welcome to this video that aims to answer the question, what is linguistic typology? I am Annemarie Verkerk from Saarland University. I teach and do research there on linguistic typology and related topics such as language change. And this is what I look like. This is a short lecture that introduces linguistic typology as one of the subfields of linguistics. It covers definitions of linguistic typology and of language universals, what explanations in linguistic typology look like, and gives a very short overview of the kind of properties of languages that have been investigated from a typological perspective. I'd like to start with two definitions of linguistic typology from two introductory textbooks that should be helpful to you. The first by Whaley and the second by Velupillai. Whaley states that linguistic typology is the classification of languages or components of languages based on shared formal characteristics. And Velupillai states that linguistic typology is the systematic study and comparison of language structures. Let's take these statements apart a little bit. Here I'm following the first chapter of the textbook by Whaley and the second chapter of the textbook by Velupillai. The first component of these definitions is cross-linguistic comparison. This implies that it is not enough to describe any particular feature of a language individually. If we want to do linguistic typology, we could, for instance, study relative clauses in English, gender marking in Swahili, or syntactic alignment in Arabic, but none of these studies would be typological. Linguistic typology always involves cross-linguistic comparison of some kind. The second component of these definitions concerns the unit of comparison. Linguistic typology is either concerned with the classification of components of language or of languages as wholes. The classification of components of languages is focused on a particular linguistic construction, for instance, the passive, the pronoun system, or the vowel inventory. Using cross-linguistic data, all the variation that is attested in these constructions is described, and classifications are made to determine the types of passives, pronoun systems, or vowel inventories that exist among the world's languages. The goal is to map variation and understand the dimensions of variation, especially in terms of how similar and how different languages can be. The unit of comparison can also be languages. Here, typological classification has the goal of classifying entire languages into categories based on shared properties. Once we have established, for instance, the various types of passive constructions that exist in the world's languages, we could take a sample of languages, determine how many of these languages have each type, and try to find explanations for the distribution across types that we'd observe. This is what most typological studies are like. And this is an example of such a classification of languages. This is a map showing the distribution of different types of numeral bases taken from WALS, the World Atlas of Language Structures, famous and big typological database. By the base of a numeral system, we mean the value n such that complex numeral expressions are constructed according to the pattern x times n plus y. For instance, the complex numeral 47 contains a base t that is multiplied with 4 to get 40, to which 7 is added to get 47. Base t is of course derived from 10, and English has a decimal base. Most languages of the world seem to have a decimal base, as you can see on this map, where decimal bases are marked in dark blue. Other languages have base 20. These languages are marked in red, and other languages have a hybrid system with both base 20 and both base 10. These are marked in pink, and in these the numbers up to 99 are expressed using a base 20, and then the system shifts to being decimal for the expression of the hundreds. Finally, some languages have restricted numeral systems, by which we mean more specifically a numeral system that cannot be used to count any higher than 20, but often even not higher than 4 or 5. These languages with restricted numeral systems are marked in white. The third component of the definitions that we have been talking about concerns the kind of thing that is the object of cross-linguistic comparison. As stated by Whaley, typology is only concerned with classification based on formal features of language. There are several other possible classifications, including the genealogical classification you see on this slide. That is, the classification of languages into language families. Other possible classifications are geographical, when languages are classified as per country or according to linguistic areas. Another possibility is demographic classification, when languages are classified in terms of demographic features, such as the size of the speaker population or the communicative situations in which the language is used. Just to recap our overview of these definitions and taking them apart. Linguistic typology is the classification of languages or components of languages based on shared formal characteristics, where we need to focus on 1. Cross-linguistic comparison, 2. The classification of components of languages or entire languages, and 3. Formal features. The quote from Philippuli adds the word systematic, so next we turn to methodology. Depending on the purpose of the particular typological study, typologists gather cross-linguistic data on many languages, starting, let's say, at 30 to 50 languages, but going up to several hundreds for any particular study. Needless to say, typologists don't know all the languages that are included in these studies. What typologists, just like other linguists, have to do is to combine different sources for their data. Typically, typologists make use of descriptive grammars, which are books that describe how a particular language, such as Hindi, Mohawk, or Hawaiian, works. But they also often ask experts or native speakers who do know a particular language intimately. They use questionnaires, elicitation, and text to obtain their data. Their purpose is to obtain the same bits of information about each language. In other words, what a particular constriction looks like in each language so that they can classify all of them appropriately. One of the questions typologists ask themselves is how many languages and which ones should feature in typological research. As you may know, there are approximately 7,000 languages that we know about, hence it is impossible to survey all of them. Many of these are not described, and surveying those who are would just take too long. Many typologists therefore try to use or to compile so-called unbiased samples of at least 100 languages in order to capture as much linguistic variation as possible, while at the same time minimizing genealogical bias and areal bias. This means that they avoid sampling languages that are closely related or known to be spoken in the same linguistic area, because these languages have not acquired their particular characteristics independently from each other. The term linguistic typology goes hand in hand with another term, that of language universals. The reason for that is that typologists do not simply aim to classify languages, to bin them into types. Actually, they mean to identify systematic patterns, to identify properties that hold for most, if not all, known human languages, and thus to contribute to the central question of linguistics, namely, what is language? Such rules are known as language universals. What is important to stress is that language universals are empirical claims. In Whaley's terms, they are descriptions of patterns found in observed language data, and hence their accuracy can be tested by applying them to previously unstudied languages. The most famous language universals are word order universals. Here is an example from Lehmann 73. Lehmann states that in verb-object languages, that is, languages which have the order verb and then the object, nominal modifiers such as the relative clause, adjectives, and genitives follow nouns, while in object-verb languages, so in verbs which have the object and then the verb, these nominal modifiers precede nouns. He illustrates this claim with examples from a single language, Japanese, but note that his statement applies to most, if not all, languages of the world. These are the same examples that Lehmann cites, but now they have been annotated with the so-called interlinear gloss so that we can understand the meaning of the words and morphemes in each sentence. The object of each sentence, book, is marked in red, and the verb in each sentence, read or reading, is marked in black, or the verb phrase rather, actually. As you can see, Japanese is a verb final language. The object precedes the verb, so the book always precedes reading. The various nominal modifiers, so in the first sentence the relative clause, in the second sentence the adjective, and in the third sentence the genitive, all precede the head noun book. Again, the typological statement by Lehmann is that in OV languages, so in object-verb order languages or verb-final languages, nominal modifiers precede nouns. And this is not true just of Japanese, but it's supposedly true of most, if not all, languages. That is what makes it a universal. So of course, Lehmann's work is from 73, and it's just here, I put it here as an example. So we may ask, is Lehmann's statement still true? Not entirely. Let's have a look at the order of relative clause and noun in comparison with the order of object and verb. This is another map from the World Atlas of Language Structures made by Matthew Dreyer. It shows us that verb-final languages may have both relative clause noun order, like in Japanese. These languages are marked in dark blue, but it also shows that some verb-final languages have noun relative clause order, and these are marked in light blue. If you look at the distribution of these two colors of blue, it seems that there is an areal effect such that verb-final languages and relative clause noun order is frequent in Eurasia, but not elsewhere. Languages with verb-object order are actually almost all noun relative clause order, so that part of the statement by Lehmann is still correct. This illustration brings us to the different kinds of universals that we can distinguish. The major division is between absolute, exceptionless universals and statistical tendencies or statistical universals, which describe tendencies or rules that are true of almost but not all languages. There are hardly any absolute universals of language left that are not tautologic in some sense. In other words, that do not make claims about the things that make language. So the most interesting types of universals are on the right side of the table. These are on top unconditional statistical universals, statements which have been claimed to be absolute universals in the past, such as almost all languages distinguish nouns and verbs, and almost all languages have affixal tense aspect marking on verbs. And in the lower right cell we find statistical implicational universals, statements such as if a language has verb-object order, it almost always has relative clause noun order. If you were paying attention on the former slide, you will have noted that on the Walls map by Dreyer, there are 5 exceptions to this universal. At least on the Walls map, there might be more, of course, that we don't know about from Walls. The case against absolute language universals is made famously by Evans and Levinson in their 2009 paper called The Myth of Language Universals. And this article summarizes cross-linguistic studies on a lot of universals, some of which are summarized in this box, showing that there are exceptions to all of them. Their main point here is that while there are significant recurrent patterns in organization, or in other words, there are lots of statistical universals or statistical tendencies, these should be explained as stable engineering solutions, rather than fixed rules that operate in the human language faculty. The kind of questions that have been asked in linguistic typology, especially with regard to language universals, have changed rapidly. In 1963, Joseph Greenberg proposed a set of both absolute and statistical universals on the basis of a sample of 30 languages. This was the kickstart of modern linguistic typology. As Song puts it in his 2010 Oxford Handbook of Linguistic Typology, Greenberg was asking, what is possible? He was asking, what are the possible patterns of typological variation? This has shifted to the question of what is probable, as, including more languages, made it clear that many absolute universals were actually statistical tendencies and not universals in an absolute sense. And then since the 2000s, typologists have been asking what's where why, to quote a famous quote from Bickel 2007. This is for a large part due to the availability of large typological databases, most notably the World Atlas of Language Structures, but there are many more, and these allow us to observe areal, social, cultural, and historical patterns of typological variation. This brings us to the topic of explanations. As stated earlier, typology is not just classification into linguistic types. Typologists typically are invested in explanations for the distributional patterns that they find. We can distinguish internal and external explanations, as Whaley does in his introductory textbook. Internal explanations start from the idea that language systems have intrinsic properties that are not necessarily shared by other human abilities. This is very close to the kind of explanations of language structure put forward by generative linguistics, and internal explanations are not common in typology, because I guess it's more focused on functional explanations overall. External explanations have to do with mostly cognitive factors, aside from the language system. Whaley gives 5 different types of external explanations. First of all, discourse. This relates to the universals that arise through the way people structure the information flow in their speech, for instance by putting old information first and new information second. Processing. This relates to the limitation on language structures imposed by ease or difficulty in processing or production. Economy, which dictates that predictable or common elements in language tend to be reduced or dropped entirely. The perception-cognition interface, when language is found to be structured along the human perceptual or cognitive abilities and restrictions. And iconicity, when the form of some linguistic expression reflects a real-world property of what is being denoted. I'll give examples of each. This figure shows the distribution of how long it takes between speakers to take turns in 10 different languages. The authors, which are Stevers et al. 2009, identify a window of 0 to 200 milliseconds in which most turns end and another person starts speaking. This optimal window isn't universal. Overlap is avoided, presumably because it decreases comprehension, and too long silences are avoided as well. These may flag various things, for instance that the listener hasn't understood or objects to what the speaker is saying, and so on. This preferred window of 0 to 200 milliseconds to change turns between speakers is a universal rooted in discourse. Word order universals have been largely explained by processing explanations. So processing has been a very important explanation in trying to account for word order universals. One example is Hawkins' heaviness principle. One example that he gives is that among nominal modifiers, relative clauses are heaviest and tend to follow the noun. Demonstratives and numerals are lightest and tend to precede the noun, while genitives and adjectives are in between with regard to heaviness. If we find that a particular syntactic structure features heavy modifiers before the head noun, it impedes processing, because hearers have to wait for a long time before they actually get to the head noun. Hence, speakers prefer constructions where heavy modifiers are post-nominal. Over time, these preferences lead to the observed universals. Iconicity and economy have competing roles in one example, so in explaining so-called differential object marking. Differential object marking takes place when some but not all direct objects in a language receive overt case marking. It's dependent on both the animacy scale and the definiteness scale that you see here. And Eisen 2003 has explained differential object marking in terms of competing iconicity and economy constraints. The iconicity constraint states that the structure of language should match the structure of experience. That means that highly prominent and thus marked direct objects, which are located towards the left of these two scales, should receive case marking, while the economy constraint states that the linguistic expressions should be minimized when possible. Hence, overt case marking of direct objects is penalized. The relative importance of the iconicity constraint versus the economy constraint in individual languages explains the cross-linguistic variation that is found regarding differential object marking in the languages of the world. As for an example of how our perception and cognition constrain language, we can look at the textbook example of the implicational hierarchy of basic color terms. Across languages, it has been found that languages that have small sets of color terms, languages that have such a small set include them going from the left to the right of this hierarchy. So if a language has 2 color terms, it would have terms for black versus white, or actually kind of dark color versus light color. Then if a language has 3 terms, it would have a term for dark colors, light colors, and red, and so on, going from the left to the right on the hierarchy. Kay and McDaniel in 1978 have found that this hierarchy is grounded in human anatomy. Exposure to black and white colors produces maximally distinctive neurological responses. Of all the remaining colors, red produces the most distinctive response from black and white, and then green, and so on. So the fact that the smaller color vocabularies of the languages of the world are seemingly organized along this hierarchy is simply due to the way in which the human visual system works. I would like to add 2 more explanations in typology, which are often left as implicit or as a way to more sort of explain away exceptions that we find to, for instance, universals. These are genealogy, the language family relationships between languages, and geography, the belonging of certain languages to particular linguistic areas. As an example, take Hammerstrom 2015, which is a talk on the word order of subject, object, and verb in 5,230 languages. This is the biggest sample I know of. This study identifies a universal tendency for word orders. In other words, the frequency of each possible order when controlling for historical and areal dependencies. And it finds that SOV order, when taking these dependencies into account, is the most favored word order. But in fact, the most important factor in explaining word order patterns is the word order of the immediate ancestor, then this universal tendency to be SOV, and then the third factor in explaining word order of any particular individual language is the word order favored by neighboring languages. So this is a clear case for the importance of family relationships and areal relationships in explaining typological variation. As a last slide on explanations in typology, this is a figure on correlations between various linguistic and non-linguistic variables by Ladd et al. 2014. The red boxes show properties of words that have been studied within languages, and the boxes on the right are properties that have been studied between languages. And one example of these studies in Lupjan and Dale is Lupjan and Dale 2010. This is now a famous study on the negative correlation between morphological complexity and population size. If the relationship between linguistic and non-linguistic factors interests you, Ladd et al. 2014 is really a study to read. I have almost reached the end of this short lecture, and I would like to conclude with a crude overview of the subdomains, if you will, of linguistic typology, or in other words, in which domains of grammar we find typological research. These are phonology, morphology, semantics and the lexicon, pragmatics, and syntax. Phonological typology is a very big subfield of typology, with research being done on the inventories of consonant and vowel qualities, both the size and the content. Research being done on tone, the presence and absence of common or rare phonemes, of syllable structure, stress, rhythm, and various other aspects of phonology. And several chapters of the World Atlas of Language Structures are devoted to phonological typology. Morphological typology goes a long way back, but it seems to be less commonly researched in the last decades. Sapir in the 1920s developed these two indices that you can see here, on which morphological characteristics can be measured. The first one, the index of synthesis has on the left isolating languages, where every word is monomorphemic. The Sinitic or Chinese languages are famously isolating languages. On the other hand, the index of synthesis, so on the right side, we have synthetic languages or even polysynthetic languages, where basically utterances are inflected roots. Some native North American languages are famous for being polysynthetic, where basically one sentence is one inflected root with various morphology attached to it. On the index of fusion, at the bottom of the slide, on the left we find agglutinative languages, where morphemes are easily segmentable, and the textbook example of such a language is Turkish, and this we can contrast on the right-hand side with fusional languages, where morphemes are merged together and there's no one-to-one meaning morpheme relationship. The textbook example of such a language is Latin. So since many languages have aspects of being isolating, synthetic, polysynthetic, agglutinative, and fusional, these classifications are no longer applied, but typologists have construed more fine-grained measures of morphological typology. Some relative terms are fusion, exponence, and flexivity. Semantic typology or lexical typology is a smaller branch of typology, which has focused mostly on a particular set of semantic domains listed here. These are numerals, color terms, body part terms, kinship terminologies, spatial relations, frames of reference, motion, and fault biology. Pragmatic typology is a relatively small but growing field, so here I've just listed a few key papers from one particular lab and books that illustrate this topic. These papers deal with cross-linguistic conversation and interaction, turn-taking, and the kind of communicative infrastructure that is both universal or language particular. Syntactic typology, in the broadest sense of the word, is the biggest subfield of typology. Typologists here have dealt with word order, both sentential and adnominal. They have dealt with nominal categories, so everything that we need to describe the noun and the noun phrase, including gender, number, definiteness, demonstratives, case, and so on, as well as verbal categories, where we deal with categories such as tense, aspect, mood, evidentiality, and so on. And of course, they have also worked on the syntax of simple clauses, dealing with topics such as alignment, person marking, passives, causatives, negation, question marking, nonverbal predication, and so on. And of course, also with complex clauses, including relative clauses and other multi-clause sentence types, and for everything else that we can think of. I would like to finish with this small list of online resources that can help you further your studies of linguistic typology. If you are still listening, thank you for listening. I hope this lecture was of use to you. I'm happy to make these slides available to you, and you should be able to find my email address online. Thank you very much again.